Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'm excited to do this morning with all of you. And I'm so glad you're here for this. So just give me one moment to share my screen and get the presentation up, and then we will get going. All right. We're all good. I hope everybody can see my screen. All right. So welcome to the Art of Having Hard Conversations. A little bit about me is my background is in culinary, actually. I have a degree in baking and pastry arts, and I began working in the nonprofit world as an executive chef. And then about 5 years ago, I founded the nonprofit that I currently run, which is Louder Than Silence. And we do long-term care, community, and resources for survivors of sexual violence. So that is specifically what we do here. And what that looks like is I've had a lot, a lot of interactions with people over the years between working in hospitality and then also having a lot of very deep conversations with the folks in our community, as you might imagine. And so, as I've done this work and as I've kind of figured out the threads of what makes a conversation go well versus what makes a conversation kind of go off the rails a little, that is how I ended up with this presentation and wanting to share that with all of you. So for the presentation this morning, we are focusing on what it looks like to interact with survivors, right? How to hear their stories, how to sit with those experiences. However, you will find that most of this translates to just everyday life, right? We have all had challenging conversations, I'm sure. And so this is applicable for work, for advocacy, for your personal life. And yeah, so that's what we're doing here today. So we are discussing what's at play in conversations, reviewing communication basics, explaining how to handle something that's a painful or emotionally heavy, and chatting through what goes wrong in conversations and how to address that. We'll also be doing some Q&A times. So throughout this presentation, I'll pause at different points and ask if there's any questions, if anything is confusing or needs some clarity. I'm happy to do that as we go along. If there's a lot of questions, I might have to push them off to the end just to make sure we get through the whole presentation. But the hope is that we can kind of have this be a little bit more of a chat. So it's sometimes helpful for people to think about a conversation that they had that went particularly not great, as we're having this conversation today. And then you might be able to pick out some points of like, oh, if I had done this, then like that might have helped it go a little bit more smoothly. So that's my suggestion for getting us started. And also because we've probably all had a long week and we've been doing a lot of different sessions, I wanted to start by just taking a couple of deep breaths together as a group to just kind of center ourselves and like get into the headspace for this. So I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths and I invite you to join me. All right. So I love to start with this quote because I think it just really resonates with me. But this idea of before you speak, ask yourself, is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it true? And does it improve the silence? This was said by Satya Sai Baba, who is an Indian guru. And I think it really helps to slow things down. Like this is kind of the thought behind what we're doing here is instead of automatically responding, taking these pauses. And so we're going to start off with the foundation of conversations. So I like to say the 5 W's of the conversation affects the how the conversation goes. So that is the what, where, when, why, and who. And I put who last because we'll go a little bit more into a deep dive with that. But the what is defining the main thing that you are there for in the conversation before you go into it. So, for instance, we all kind of know asking a boss for a raise would be approached differently than having like a tough conversation with a friend. So just having a sense of the what behind the drive for the conversation. And then the where. What is the environment like that you are having this conversation in? Is it loud? Is it chaotic? Is it peaceful? Is it quiet? Is it comfortable? Is it hot? Is it cold? All of these will affect how the conversation goes because this is the setting, right? And so the more things that we have pulling on our attention, the harder it is to stay present and in the moment in the conversation. And then the when of the conversation. So the time of the day, if it is after something that is really calming or stressful, or is it before something that's particularly calming or stressful? So we want to make sure that there is time for the depth of the conversation as well, right? Like we don't want to start a really deep conversation if we only have 5 minutes before the next thing that we're doing. And we also want to make sure that we are staying rooted in the present moment, that we don't want to be stuck in the past and we don't want to be living in the future. And yes, of course, if somebody's sharing a story that is in the past, but it is the reason you are telling the story is to connect with the person in front of you. So we want to make sure that we are staying present in that idea instead of living in that past moment and talking from there. And I can clarify that a little bit as well if that's unclear. Um, and then the why of the conversation is like knowing to what end this conversation is happening. And for all conversations, it's actually to build some level of rapport or relationship. So even if it's information sharing, the ultimate goal here is to connect more deeply with the other person. And if we can keep that why in mind as we're interacting, it really helps kind of clarify and settle out the other items that get in the way. And then the last, but certainly not least, is the who, which is a whole nother slide. And excuse me for one moment. All right, so who is in the conversation? It might seem very obvious, but it actually is a little bit more than it might seem. So there's you, which can be plural you or singular you, it can be like two people or a group of people. Me, right? So the person who is speaking, but also our baggage and our identities are in the conversation as well. So going through each of these, the you in the conversation. So when most of us think of a conversation that's gone wrong, we think of how the other person said something or did something that was difficult or painful or challenging. But unfortunately, the you in the conversation can't be controlled by me, right? I cannot control anybody else's responses or reactions. I can only control me. So when we think about the other person or people in the conversation, we need to approach it from understanding we can't control that, but we also aren't responsible for it either. The other person is responsible for their own reactions and all of those things. But when we're going into hard conversations, we do want to check with ourselves, is this a person who is interested in and able to build more relationship? And the idea here is discernment versus judgment when we're considering this, right? We don't want to judge the other person. We don't want to assume anything negatively about them or kind of like put them somewhere mentally. But we can check within ourselves. Do I feel at peace when I think about bringing this up to them? Do I feel like they will receive it well? That is discernment. Discernment comes from a peace within, and judgment comes from information from without. And so when we're thinking about, can I have this conversation? We want to sit with our own discernment and we want to make sure that we're not judging the other person. But then the part of the who here that we can control is ourselves, is the me part of the conversation. The me is the only thing that any of us can be responsible for because it's the only thing that we can control. And the key takeaway for today is that the better you know yourself, the better conversations will go. And you will hear me say that several times, so hopefully it doesn't sound too much like a broken record. But the better you know yourself, the better conversations will go. No one can avoid an obstacle if they don't know it's there, right? And so the more you can see yourself, the more you can make sure that you're not tripping over any obstacles that you didn't know existed. But then also, in these conversations, it's our baggage. As much as we would like to say that we're all entirely clean slates and that we don't bring anything with us, that is simply not the case. Each of us has our own set of assumptions and biases, and we have our own patterns. So, what I mean by patterns is that as we do a regular activity in our life, that becomes a neural pathway that is kind of short-circuited. So if you think of tying your shoes, right? Once you learn how to tie your shoes, you don't have to think about the steps each and every time. Well, our brains do similar things when it comes to interactions and conversations. If we learn certain patterns, those will automatically come into play even when we're not expecting it. So being aware of how we tend to interact in certain situations will make it much easier when we have similar interactions with other people in other situations. So, for instance, if I have had some number of really challenging work situations, and I learn a lesson of, oh, I won't be hurt if I like share my opinion at work. Well, we might be in a volunteer experience and feel the same way, right? So, like that might come up and limit ourselves because of this pattern that's actually from a different situation. But these things are very much at play in the conversation. And then, last but not least, our identities are at play. And our identities are the ways that we are fulfilling roles in our lives. So, are we teachers? Are we students? Are we siblings? Things like that. So, all of these roles are also in the conversation as well because it is how we define who we are. And we get to learn a little bit more about ourselves. So I'm going to be toggling between this slide and the next slide a little bit to kind of give you some understanding. And then this will also be available after the end of the conference. So I'll be sending this out to the conference folks so they can send this worksheet to you if you're interested. But we have these columns here. So column 1 is to list the adjectives that describe you. So that's this column right here in the middle. So the adjectives are the descriptive words. Are you tenacious? Are you determined? Are you tough? Are you creative? Are you flexible? But having these descriptive words is what is true about you at your core self, right? Like we all have these different ways that we describe ourselves. That is what we prioritize. And so when we can see them all together, if we take the time to do this activity, and we put all these adjectives together, then we can start to see what some of our values are. So, for instance, if I value creativity and flexibility and going with the flow, one of my values might be that I create space for people where they are as they're interacting with me. But if some of my adjectives are being timely or structured, then maybe my value is that I want to bring to a conversation this idea of stability, right? And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but again, knowing what we're bringing and knowing what we value will help the conversation go better. So then the next column is listing the nouns that describe you. So these are the things I was mentioning in the previous slide that are our identities. So that's the middle column here on this sheet. So the nouns would be things like sister, aunt, a teacher, student, etc. But these are the roles that we're in our lives. Some we've chosen, some have been chosen for us. Some are just part of the structure of life. But having an idea of these nouns is really, really good because the more we identify with these nouns, the more strongly we feel about them, the more they will come up in conversations, and often without us anticipating that or expecting that to happen. So, the way I suggest addressing that is to think about the concept of changing those nouns into verbs. So there's kind of two categories here of verbs. So one is like verbs that naturally kind of flow with it. So for the instance of if I'm saying like I'm a renter, I would want to change that to I rent where I live. And the benefit of this is that if somebody said something negative about renters and I identify really strongly with that, then now I personally feel attacked. But if how I approach it is I just rent where I live, if somebody says something negative about renters, then it doesn't impact me because I don't identify that as part of who I am. And then there's the other type of nouns, which are the ones that aren't easily converted to a verb. So, for instance, the idea of like, I'm a sister. So, for those, I recommend picking words like prioritize, value, respect, etc. So, for instance, instead of saying I am a sister, I would say I prioritize my sibling relationships. So you see, it changes from this idea of like, this is what this role might look like to this is what I'm choosing, this is the action that I'm choosing to take in my life. So I know that that was all a lot of information, so I wanted to give us a second here to pause if there's any questions or if we want to clarify any of these things. So feel free to just pop off mute and ask a question if you have it. And this is not a requirement. If you don't have any questions, that is totally fine. All right, great. So I will keep going, and you'll have time to ask questions as well a little bit later. All right, so I wanted to also touch on some communication basics. A lot of us have heard this idea of like active listening, which is great. These are kind of the ways that I talk about that concept to make it a little bit more approachable. So, when communicating, we want to stay present and open. And staying present means multiple things. It is staying present mentally, physically, and emotionally. So, we want to make sure that when we are sitting with someone, that we are just demonstrating the body language that indicates that we are present and open, that we are not distracted, that we're not thinking about other things, that we are not emotionally reacting to something else in that space. We want to stay fully open and connected with the other person or the other people when we are in these conversations. And then the next is know what you are feeling, right? And there is a very big difference between saying, I am feeling, fill in the blank, and you made me feel, fill in the blank. So I am feeling, using that phrase, I am feeling, is just simply communicating to the other person what your inner state is, right? So if I am, for instance, presenting at a conference, I might say, I am feeling a little anxious. And that is what it is. It is simply more information for the other people to work with. But if I am saying you made me feel, then what that does is it makes another person or other people responsible for your inner state. And they can't be, right? They cannot affect your inner state, only you can. And so we want to make sure that we are communicating simply what our inner state is and not inadvertently putting that on someone else. And then also, as we're communicating, we want to make sure that we are providing thoughtful responses versus reacting. So if you've ever been in one of those conversations where you like get heated and you say something and the other person says something and it just kind of goes, and then all of a sudden you're just like, I don't know how we got here. That's this. We want to make sure that we are not just having our patterns come up, as I mentioned from before, that we are not just reacting to what is happening, but are taking the time to actually thoughtfully respond to what's coming up. And we want to make sure that we are sticking with our values. So, from the worksheet that I was mentioning previously, we want to make sure that what we say we prioritize in conversations is what we're actually prioritizing, right? If I am prioritizing that I create space for the other person, I want to check in with myself to make sure that I am actually following through on my own values. And we also want to slow things way down when we are in tough conversations. Sometimes much more slowly than you think it should be reasonable. But when things go off the rails, when things go wrong, it is often because things have started to speed up too much and the reactions are happening instead of the responses. So, in these tough conversations, slow things way down. And you can do that in a couple of different ways that doesn't seem so awkward because it might seem a little bit awkward to have some of these slowing features in play. But one of the ways you can do that is with something called verbal pauses. So those would be things like saying, "Oh, let me think about that for a second," or, "Oh, what a great question. I've never considered that." So you can still engage with the other person, but you are not specifically interacting with whatever it was that they just said previously. And another way to slow things down, if you need even more time, is something called physical pauses. So I love to use this example of like somebody says something that might be really challenging or overwhelming or difficult. And then it's just a like, okay, so I hear you. Just 1 second. Right? So it's a nice little physical pause. You just take a drink, you reset. Depending on the circumstances, you can say, like, I want to respond to you, I'm going to run to the restroom quickly, etc. So I see the hand. I'm just going to get through the slide and then I'll come to you. So we want to make sure we're slowing things way down in conversations. And then we need to be aware of our tone, body language, facial expressions, and word choice. So, depending on who you ask, they say between 90 and 96% of communication is actually not verbal. And so, the vast majority of what is being communicated is not the words that you're sharing. It is how you are in the space with the other person. And we want to keep that top of mind. I often joke about how I don't always know what my face is doing. So like there are times in conversations where I will literally just have to like ask myself like what's my face doing right now? Because I want to make sure that like my face is not showing like anger or frustration or whatever if that's not what I am wanting to communicate to the other person. And we want to also in these spaces not assume anything and keep assessing. So what I mean by that is we cannot possibly have all of the details of all of the background for any particular interaction. And so what often happens is we fill in the gaps, right? Like that is a normal human thing to do. And we want to make sure that our assumptions aren't at play in how we're interacting with the other person. And we want to assess what our own biases are coming into the conversation. Again, as much as we would love to be a blank slate, we all have our own stuff that we're coming into a conversation with. And we want to make sure that our assumptions and our own biases aren't what's coming to the forefront. We want to make sure that we are present with the other person and thoughtfully responding to where they're at. And the last, but certainly not least, of communication basics is no bypassing. So there's this term called bypassing. It's used often as intellectually bypassing or spiritual bypassing, but it's the idea that instead of sitting in the really tough emotion with a person, we try to relieve that pressure by incorporating something outside of it to kind of deflect. So, intellectual bypassing is one of the very common ways that we do this and see it very prevalently in interactions in our lives. So, this is something like somebody shares a really painful part of their story and reacting with a like, oh, I read an article about that. That is creating some distance between you and them because now you are talking about something that you've intellectualized, and we want to make sure that we're sitting in the emotional moment with them. So we want to share our own personal understanding of it. So if a person shares their story, you can say, "Oh, I understood this to be connected. Is that what you see too?" Right? It's a way of interacting with person to person instead of having this idea that's way up there and out over there that's not actually in the in between us, right? Because the why of the conversation is to interact and to build relationship. All right, so I wanted to take a moment to circle back to the conversation, or sorry, to the question that popped up. So I don't see the hand raised anymore, but I wanted to see if there's a question I could answer.
Yes, it was me.
All right.
Okay, so my question is,
Mhm,
how do you communicate with someone who may has been there like 15 plus years, started the program, started the company,
mhm,
you have new hires, your new hires may have some amazing new day and age work ability and being able to basically understand where we're at in this day and age versus 15 years ago.
mhm.
Some people I feel like are stuck in the past, but how do we move forward and communicate? I'm a very bubbly, outgoing, loud person by nature. And so
That's great.
I know that my passion behind what we do shows. There's no question asked, to the point where I even know that my zeal and passion can sometimes come across disrespectful because I'm so passionate, even
Mm,
though I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I just know something may work, right? Like I'm without a
mhm,
shadow of a doubt, no. That being said, I have in the past year, couple years now, someone told me that my zeal and passion like 10 years ago could come across disrespectful. So I've learned from that and I've been
mhm.
very like focused on making sure that doesn't happen. But how do you talk to someone who's been there for so long to get your voice across, even if it's in a respectful manner, but you don't feel like they really hear you?
Yeah, so I guess my question back to you is, does it feel like they're not hearing you, or like do you know that they're not actually hearing you? Right? Like are
It
they
doesn't
able to
it
like
doesn't feel oh sorry, go ahead.
I was just say so like the difference kind of being like if you provide insight into something that like perhaps should change, like do you see their understanding of what you're saying like could possibly be changed? Or is it that like it's not even getting that far where it's like not even being received at all?
No, no, I'm not gonna say it's not being received. I'm gonna say that I think because maybe the balance of like being here a year versus being here 10
Mm,
years or
yeah,
being here, you know what I'm saying? Like just being new to
gotcha.
the whole organization. And honestly, sometimes I know it's just me, my thinking because of past traumas that have happened in other work areas.
Mhm.
So sometimes I overly think, and I think that,
I
oh
understand.
man, like
Yeah.
if I do, yeah, so it may not even be, but because someone doesn't have, like, you know how you have face features, like mine are very obvious. Some
Mhm.
people's are not. Like
Right.
you are the same. So you can't tell sometimes. You know what
Right.
I'm saying? Like
Yes, I
even if they
do.
could raise an eyebrow, I would be okay with
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different suggestions that I have here. One is, um, and I'm happy to like send you the worksheet as well, but knowing again, like knowing your values. So like for me, I often would like go through that kind of anxious cycle of like, did I say that the right way? They didn't seem to like hear me, like, going through all of those things. That if I could say, okay, I am coming to every conversation with these three things in mind. And if I follow these three things, I will say that the conversation was successful despite how they might interact with it. Right. So, like, am I being true to myself and what I'm valuing here? And that helps eliminate, for me at least, a lot of the anxiety because then it's a like, okay, I know I prioritized what I said I wanted to prioritize. And then with the other parts of it, it could be a way to connect a little bit more with the person. So you could use it as a way to, like, as a bridge to say like I don't know, like I feel like I'm being too much, or like I feel like I am just like, maybe blurting out something and like I'm afraid how you're going to interact with it, right? But like being really just aware of how we're feeling when we're sharing those things. Because I am very similar to you, Melissa, in that like I've described myself as like burning with the passion of a thousand suns. And that like if I'm in this space, then sometimes it's like, oh, is that too much? And so I have learned that if I actually use that to connect with the other person, it helps kind of smooth out some of those areas I'm feeling the friction. So then I can say like, hey, I'm like, I don't want to step on your toes, but also like I have this like idea that I'm really excited about. Is it okay if I share that? Right. So then it's a like you're sharing where you're coming from, and again, because we can't control how the other people interact with us, like we don't know what their assumptions are about our approach, right? So like if we're coming in a little hot, maybe like their assumption might be that you are just trying to like steamroll them when instead you might just really be excited, right? So like if we can help kind of bridge that gap for them and say like, I'm really excited about this idea I had, can I share it with you? Right? Like that then is helping kind of set the stage for them a little bit. And then you can kind of gauge how they are responding to you once you kind of like share that foundational piece. Does that make sense?
Oh yes, it
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Like I said, I know my personality, and I know sometimes it's a lot, it's a much, but it's okay.
it's okay. You're you, and we all need each of us to be you, like we all
Yeah,
need the full expression of ourselves. And so, but do you feel like
the-
that was helpful? Do you kind of have a sense of like what
yes,
the next step might be?
yes, and
Great.
I know that too. Trying to Nobody's perfect, but I know even through the communication part, you
Mhm.
you feel like you want to be perfect, and being perfect is so draining. And that's also what I'm working on, is to
Yes.
stop being perfect. So communication is really great, especially this workshop, because when you cannot be so perfect, maybe all these other
Mhm.
signs won't fester up.
Right. Yes. I love the saying that perfect is the enemy of good, that we want to approach things well, but when we're focused on perfect, then it becomes really easy to like kind of get distracted from just like doing something well. Um, so I very much hear you. And um part of this is just being aware, right? Like as I said, the more we understand ourselves, the more our conversations will go better. So like as you're seeing these things, then you can kind of get a sense of like, oh, I can take this step now because I see this and I understand it. So even asking the
Thank you.
questions is a great step
Mhm.
forward. It really is.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. All right. So with that, let me do a quick time check. All right. I'm gonna jump into our fun next slide, which is sitting with discomfort. So, whenever I am approaching a conversation that I know will be a little bit challenging, I ask myself these series of two questions. So, the first question, step one, is can I make space for this? So, if the answer is yes, you continue to step two. If the answer is no, you discontinue the interaction. And then step two is asking, do I want to? And when I say this, it's not want from kind of a like surface level kind of thing. It's a like, is it in line with my values? Do I want to prioritize this? This is a like deep resonance within ourselves that is saying like, do I want to do this? So like, do I want to have tough conversations? No, like I don't think any of us really like wants to. But do I want to from the sense of like, is it within my value system? Is it something that I really deeply care about? Then if the answer is yes, then continue with the interaction. But if the answer is no, we also want to stop the interaction. And stopping it doesn't mean stopping it forever, right? It can simply be saying, actually, like, I don't have the space for this right now. Can we talk about this later? It doesn't need to be all or nothing. It can say, I don't I don't have the capacity for it at this moment. But saying no to either of these doesn't mean that you did anything wrong or bad, and there's no judgment attached to either of these. It's a greater disservice to both of you if the answer is no, but you act as though the answer is a yes. Because then either you don't have the space and you are indicating that you do, or it's something that you really don't want to do, and the other person will feel that even if you don't say it. So a one of the examples I'd love to use for this concept is if one of you here for this session said that you wanted to share your story at length with me right now in front of this group. So step one would be, can I make space for this? Well, yes, I can. Like I can be emotionally present. I can hear that. I can do that. But step two is, do I want to? No, I don't want to. And I don't want to not because I don't want to hear your story. I don't want to because it's not in line with my values. What I said I would do is this presentation right now. And it would not be in line with my values to go back on my word to listen to your story in this setting, right? So again, it's not that like you did anything but wrong by asking or I did anything wrong by saying no. It is simply saying, is this the time and place for this? And so for instance, in this example, if someone did say, I wanted to share my story with you, then I can say, absolutely great, let's do that one-on-one another time, right? That would be in line with my values and with providing space for this. And as you are having challenging conversations, keep asking yourself these questions, right? It's not a like, oh, we're going into it. So I asked myself this once. It's keep checking in. Do I still have space for this, right? Especially with very heavy conversations, it uses up our emotional space, our emotional bandwidth. So we want to make sure that we still have space for what's happening and that we can be honest with ourselves and with the other person about it because we don't want to get to a point where we are so emotionally drained that then we become reactive and we can't provide the space that the other person needs. And again, remember, the better you know yourself, the better conversations will go. It's easier to answer these questions the better you know yourself and what your capacity is. All right, so when we get into heavy topics, so remember that the focus here is that the person is sharing as a relational touch point. We want to focus on the idea that the person is sharing because they want you to understand them better, right? So that is the baseline that we are working off of with all of this. And it's very important to know that you can't fix big problems for other people. they have to be the ones driving the change. So, like, first of all, we're not responsible for other people, but also making decisions on another person's behalf when they are able to make those decisions for themselves. Like, of course, we make decisions for people who, like children, right, that we are responsible for. But if a person is able to make decisions for themselves, we want to promote them making those decisions. We don't want to be making them on their behalf. And big problems became big problems because of a long series of events that got the person there. It's not flipping a switch. Like, there's nothing that you can say that takes away years of pain. What you can say is, I am here, I am present, I am with you in this as you take this journey. But you can't fix the problem for them. And this is very closely tied with the next point, which is we don't want to automatically give advice or go into problem solving mode. As I like to say, people aren't cars. It's not that you like diagnose a flat tire and you just switch it out. It's a lot of consistent decision making over a long period of time. And we want to help the other person make those steps forward, not try to do it on their behalf. So if I am in a conversation with someone and they have shared something that's really challenging that they are working through, like, I will ask them, like, do you want my advice? Like, are you like, is this conversation for you to get a solution, or is this conversation because you just need somebody to hear you? Right? They get to drive the interaction and not me. But automatically launching in with advice often leads people to feel like they are the problem to be solved instead of you being there with them as they are working on solving their own problems. And inspiring change only works when we've built a lot of relational equity with the person, and even then, tread lightly. So, even people that I know really well, when they are talking about something that's challenging, I will still ask them if they want advice or not, because we want to maintain the relationship as the priority. Relationship is the thread. It is what we're trying to build, and so we don't want to automatically go into this mode of fixing, because that doesn't build the relationship. And you can use kind of the example of, if you walked into a store and somebody said something about, I don't know, let's say your clothing choice. You may or may not receive that well. But if it was somebody that you know really well, like a friend, and they're like, "Hey, I'm not sure if you realize that, like, that's not the best fit for you," you'd be more likely to take the friend's advice or input because you've built that relational equity. If a stranger says it, it can be very off-putting, right? So we want to make sure that if we are giving advice or going into problem solving, that we have built enough relational foundation with the person that it can tolerate that weight. We also want to make sure, as we're interacting with heavy topics, to avoid cliches and the phrase "I can't imagine." Um, Cliches are also sometimes referred to as thought-stopping cliches. So the idea of, instead of like fully engaging with the person in the emotional state, it is something that like deflects away from the conversation at hand. So for instance, somebody sharing a really difficult story, if you respond with something like, "Well, everything happens for a reason," for them to start the conversation again and get back into this mode of feeling safe and comfortable sharing is an even bigger step forward now. It takes that much more to get to the place of feeling open and sharing, because we have shut down a real conversation with something that's very impersonal. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding that. And I also recommend avoiding the phrase "I can't imagine," because often that actually means I won't imagine. So my recommendation there is to share the part that you do understand and then ask clarifying questions about the parts that maybe aren't as familiar to you. So, for instance, I don't have children. So if I have a friend who is explaining the process of like learning how to interact with her teenage children, I can say like, "Oh yes, I can imagine based on being a teenager at one point in my life, what it would be like to have parented me. Yeah, it sounds like it would be a challenge to work through that with your partner and come, be on the same page and giving independence while also being responsible. Like, yeah, I can imagine that's a lot. But like, how do you and your partner work through figuring out what discipline looks like at this age? Right. So it's acknowledging the like, oh yes, I can be here present with you with this idea. But also there's a lot of parts of this that like I'm just not familiar with. Can you help me understand those parts? And then when we are talking about heavy topics, often there's a like tangible piece that comes up that is something that can be fixed or solved. And it's easy to want to latch on to that because it is tangible. So if there is a tangible piece that you can help with, offer to follow up on it later. So, for instance, if somebody is sharing that a family member passed away, but her car also broke down and she doesn't know if she can get to the funeral, really, the challenging thing that she's talking about is the loss of the family member. We want to stay present with that. But what we can say is like, "Oh, I actually might have a solution for the car thing, but let's keep talking about your family member's passing and we'll circle back to that." So it is a way to acknowledge like, "Oh, I have a potential solution for you, but I'm not going into problem solving mode. I'm not just trying to gloss over the rest of this. I want to be here present with you as you work through the emotional piece." And then I also recommend not automatically sharing about yourself. So if you have a similar experience, again, like offering to follow up on it later or asking if they want to hear what you have been through is really helpful because it gives them the option of saying, "Oh, yes, like I do want to hear what it was like for you. Maybe that will be helpful for me." Or they can say, like, no, actually, I would prefer, to, like, keep kind of working through my stuff, right? So it gives them the choice, but we want to make sure that we're not unintentionally, again, deflecting away from the fact that this person brought up something really challenging to begin with, that we don't want it to end up being taken over with our own stuff. We want to make sure that we can hold our own stuff while holding theirs with them and for them. And, in this space, I am sure most people understand this, but we don't want to assume that physical touch is wanted. And I specifically bring this up because there's a sense of like if somebody's distressed, that like hugging them or putting your arm around them or like, touching their hand can be a very comforting thing. But especially when we're talking about, sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse, we want to make sure that we are not we are not broaching the physical touch barrier because we don't know what is triggering for the other person. So for instance, like I can remember an instance very, very specifically of like I was sharing something painful with a friend and like she decided that I needed a hug when I did not want one. And I remember how uncomfortable that made me feel that it was more because like she wanted to feel comforted and assumed that that's what I needed instead of actually letting me drive that interaction. And so we don't want to be doing that to other people, right? We want to make sure that they are the ones who are initiating that. And that is different than consent, in that we want to make sure they are the ones moving it forward, not just that we are asking. And then if they say yes, it's okay. Because in a very distressed state, especially if there's been like long term abuse, it is very difficult sometimes for some people to understand what they need and to be able to articulate it. And also, they may have their own patterns around not being able to set those boundaries with people. And so, we want to make sure that we are not inadvertently putting them in a situation where they don't feel like they can say no. So, um, so again, just don't ever assume that physical touch is desired. And you can tell by a person's body language if that is something, like if they're leaning closer to you, right? Like if they're like, you can tell when somebody is desiring that, but make sure it is them clearly demonstrating it before you do or say anything to that end. And when also talking about these heavy topics, when talking about sexual assault, sexual violence, I always encourage people at the end of these conversations to talk to a therapist. In the work that I do, we specifically recommend EMDR therapy. It's a trauma specific therapy, but it is not being said from the sense of like, oh, you're broken and messed up and like, you know, go do this thing. It's coming from the perspective of like, hey, there are professionals who are trained in helping you work through this. Like, I think you would really benefit from having someone who like knows how to help you. Like, I can be here for you, but this person has received specific training around this. So again, it's like not a like, oh yeah, you need to like fix this because you're messed up. It's a like, hey, this resource exists and I'm encouraging you to take steps in pursuing that resource. All right, so those were a lot of words. So I wanted to give a pause again to see if there's any other questions, any thoughts, anything that anybody wanted to share before we keep moving on. All right. Well, then we will keep going. So this is the slide that most people want to know about. What do we do when something goes wrong? When things go wrong in a conversation, it's almost always one of these two things. Someone is not feeling heard, or someone is reacting to something else. So I want us all to take a minute to think about the last time we had a conversation that like didn't go particularly well, and see if one of these two feels true for you. So for me, I can say, if I'm being really honest, and I am, is that as I've done my own work in healing from the sexual violence I experienced, that often I see the reaction to something else coming up in in my conversations, and so being able to understand that that's where I more often come from, it's helpful because then I can kind of tease apart what is happening in those moments. But what to do when things go wrong? So, as I mentioned before, the concept of really slowing things down. This is my number one piece of advice for anybody when they're talking about challenging interactions with other person and with another person is the more things speed up, the more reactivity comes into play, and then we just like can't manage all of the inputs that are happening at the same time. So we want to really slow things down. And again, slow things down way more than it seems like is necessary sometimes is a really good thing. And then the next step is agreeing to clear the snag. So what I mean by that is that if there's this snag, if there's this friction, if there's something that's come up in the conversation and you can feel the like heated energy, the frustration that we're not on the same page anymore, just checking in with the other person. Can we clear this? So we want to set aside what the original conversation was to actually clear what is happening that has come up to begin with. And an example of this might be that if my partner, for instance, asked me to put a dish in the dishwasher, and I feel myself bubble up with some like really strong frustration, it's not helpful to like snap back. It's helpful to say like, "Hey, can you help me clear this snag? I'm not sure what came up." And it's a very easy like, it's not about the dish and the dishwasher, right? It's about whatever bubbled up, whatever the strong emotional response was. And the original conversation, because it doesn't have the emotion attached to it, can sit there and wait for a little while. So once we've agreed to clear the snag, we want to check in with the 5 Ws, right? So has anything changed that now it's more challenging to have the conversation, right? Like, was the space previously cool and then the air conditioner broke and now it's like physically hot? Like that will change how the conversation goes. Were you taking a walk and now you've stopped? Now the wear is different. So like all of these things impact how the conversation is going. So we want to make sure that we're checking in. If we see this snag, we check in with the 5 Ws. Make sure that the how the conversation is going is not being impacted by one of those, because those are the easiest to remedy. And we also want to specifically make sure we're checking in with this like who piece of the conversation, because like have one of our patterns come up. Is it our biases or assumptions? Is it our baggage? Is it one of our identities coming into play? So we want to make sure that we are we are not bringing in our own stuff that is causing conflict or frustration in these moments. and and then this is also the point in time when you get to actually see, like, does it make sense to continue with this conversation? Right? Like if we check in with all the W's, we are, yes, like we are in a good place, generally speaking, then we can take the steps to actually resolve some of this conflict. And the best way to do that is to ask thoughtful questions. So things like, can you tell me more about how you reached that conclusion? Or at what age did you start believing that? Is it something that you taught yourself or something that somebody else taught you? And or it seems like you have some experience with this particular item. Like, can you tell me more about that? Right? We want to ask questions that are not just yes or no questions, but questions that really get to the root of like what bubbled up here? Like, why is the other person not feeling heard? Like, what is the other thing that they're reacting to? We want to make sure that we can clear out these big items so we can go back to the original what. And then also, if you need to, just like take a break, like hard conversations are hard. If you need to say, like, actually, like, let's just take a 2 minute break here, or let's take an hour break, or whatever it is, it's totally fine. Again, going back to this idea of like, do I have space for this? And do I want to? That if you find yourself getting to a point where you can't really hold space for it very well anymore, it's more of a disservice to try to have space when you don't have it. And it's better to give yourself the space that you need so that you can go back to this in a good, healthy, grounded way again. And then the last recommendation is to check to see if the snag is cleared. And what I mean by that is that if something bubbles up, right, if you see these strong emotions come into play, then you agree to clear the snag, you work through that thing. We want to make sure that there's not something else still at play, right? Like you can have something bubble up that is taking 80% of your attention, work through that, but you're still not on the same page again. So we want to make sure that we have checked to see if the snags are totally cleared or not before continuing and like going back to the original main point of what the conversation was. So those are my recommendations for what to do when things go wrong. And hopefully those will happen uh, less and less frequently as you keep knowing yourself better. But it is something that certainly we get to experience as part of this life. But now I have some space for a more extensive Q&A. So I just wanted to hear what's on your mind, if you have questions. So I just want to leave it open at first, and then if we need a little bit more prompting for our conversation, I'm happy to do so. But any questions, comments, concerns, issues, musings? All right. So I would like, if any of you are interested, or you want to, if not, again, totally fine. But I always do like to ask people if there's a specific conversation that came to mind and what you would change about it now, knowing what you know. And again, nobody's required to say anything, but I would love to hear some feedback if you are interested and able.
I'm gonna speak. I tried to go last, but it's hard for me too. Okay. So what I learned, so what I don't do already is I'm like super anxious. And so I want an answer, like I need an answer within like the same day. And so my thing now is I'm going to, well, it's a couple of things. I'm not going to read into what people's facial expressions are. I'm going to try really, really hard not to do that. And then I'm going to try really hard to have some time to understand that they may be thinking about it and not take it as a personal attack or think that I didn't say something right and then literally make myself throw up. I'm going to stop doing that too because I don't make myself throw up. I just get anxious. And so I'm going to stop doing that too and just and also know that it's okay for them to say no. And it's okay for them not to, because they may see something that I just don't know and they may not be able to share that, and that's okay. So I have to be okay to be okay.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. This like the number of times in conversations where I have to be like, okay, like that's their thing. It's not like it doesn't reflect on me. Like it's really hard to like separate those things out sometimes where it's like why haven't they responded yet? Like what, like did I say something wrong? Did I do something wrong? And being able to separate it as like, okay, like I know I asked that question well. It's not a reflection on me that they haven't responded yet. And if it does get to the point, like it might just be a like, hey, like it seems like you're thinking about this a lot. Do you want to revisit this another time? Right? Like maybe it's something that like they're so overwhelmed by that like they need a day to think about it, right? And so, at a certain point, like yes, you can like check in, but making sure it's not from a like an anxious, like, oh no, I have to like do something here, and more from a like, all right, like I've given this space, but it seems like there's something else happening. Right. And
Gotcha.
yeah, yeah. But that's
Thank
really
you.
great. I appreciate that feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, CG, in the chat, there was
Mhm.
said in the very beginning, you mentioned about identity roles. Might you explain that again, please?
Mhm. Yes. So I can go back to that slide if you give me just 1 second. All right. So the roles are the words that are the nouns that we use to describe ourselves. So some of the examples I gave, like sister, sister, daughter, it might be student, it might be teacher, employee, business owner, right? There's lots of different nouns that we can use to describe ourselves. And these are the roles that we're in. And we want to, as part of this understanding ourselves, we want to understand that like who we are as our true self is actually different than the roles that we're in. So like who I am as a person means something different than who I am, for instance, in the role of a sister. Because in the role of a sister, like I might have one idea about what that means, but somebody else might have a different idea. And so, right, that's when we have this like friction that comes up because there's different understanding and expectations. And so the more we can define ourselves by the adjective piece of it, that's really our core true self. And we are also in different roles at different points in time in our lives And for instance, like sister is presumably a lifelong noun role that we describe ourselves with. But we want to know how we want to be in the world independently of that role. And so that way we are also being consistent. And I want to check in if that if you wanted more understanding around the like how to reframe it as a verb, or if I covered it. So I believe it was Victoria. If you can
Yeah,
just, yeah.
it was how to reframe it.
Okay, yep. So reframing it is if it's I call them like the category 2 nouns, where it's again using like sister as the example. It's framing it from like what you value or what you want to prioritize or what you like respect doing. So using the example of a sister, instead of saying like I am a sister, wanting to say like, oh, I value having strong sibling relationships, or I prioritize connecting with my siblings. So it's more of a like, how do we change this idea of what this role is to like, how am I making decisions about my actions or how I am in the world that separates the like identity of who I am from the actions that I'm taking? Does that help? I can go a little bit more in depth too, if you want me to.
No, that's the last part that I was missing, and that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
He's welcome.
And then,
I'm
oh,
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I was just saying, I see in the chat another question. I supervise an individual who becomes very defensive, and I've tried several approaches, timing, follow-ups, location, mindfulness, and had little success. Any suggestions or tips? Um, yes. So my suggestion there is that when you see the other person like starting to have that posture, that like defensive posture, like immediately going into the curiosity questions then. So it's a like, hey, like I sense that something else has come up here. Can we talk through that? Can we work through that? Right. So it is a curiosity around like what is bubbling up for them, and recognizing like you can also start the conversation with like, hey, I recognize that we've had some conversations that haven't gone super well in the past. Like I'm working on changing this dynamic, and I'm happy to get your input on what might be helpful for you, right? So like calling it what it is at the beginning, but leaving it open so that they have the ability to also express what they need. And they might not know what they need, but helping them feel a little bit of ownership in the process too might be good. But really, it's the questions that I found have been really helpful for me. It's that the more that I feel like I become entrenched in the like we have to have this conversation and we have to reach this conclusion, that it's less likely that the conversation ends up going well for me. It's more of the like, okay, what is getting in the way of this relationship, and how can we remove those barriers? So if we can frame it that way, it might help kind of shift the perspective. And feel free to let me know if that was useful, or if you want some more thoughts on that. I'm happy to keep sharing, but let me know. All right, so we still do have a little bit more time, so I wanted to also keep it open if anyone else has something that they would like to share that they want to start applying in their conversations, or if they see, if any of you see anything in particular that has impacted past conversations that you want to move forward with, doing something a little bit different. All right. Well, not gonna make anybody talk if they don't want to. So I'm gonna go back to the end of the presentation. All right. So, if you, well, so first of all, thank you for coming to this presentation. I'm so glad that you were here. I hope that it was helpful for you. Oh, this is a little bit blurry on my screen, so hopefully this QR works. This is the TASA evaluation for the presentation, and I know that we'll be putting this up again in a moment. But if you're interested in learning more about our organization, Loud in the Silence, the QR on the right side is for our website. Also, you can follow us on Instagram. But I'm happy to connect with you more and answer more questions if you want. So yeah, so thank you all for being here, and I hope this was helpful for everybody. Oh, we got one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Are we good? Can we do one more?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, great. If in the past, this is the question. If in the past you have had conversations that didn't end well with someone, how do you continue moving forward with them if they refuse to let go of those negative conversations in the past? What a great question. Um, so one of the things that I think might be helpful here is to see if the person will agree with you on when we have conversations, we want to keep them in the present moment, right? And so then if you can reach that agreement with the person and do this like totally separately from any conflict, like just say, hey, I've noticed a lot of our conversations seem to bring up the past. Would you be willing to agree with me now that we want to like stay focused on the present moment? If they say yes, then if they bring something up, then you can say, okay, well, like we had chatted about not bringing up stuff from the past. Do you feel like there's something unresolved here between us? Right? So like maybe that's what they're trying to say, but haven't really said it. Or it could simply be that they are kind of like stuck in this pattern mentally themselves. And if that's the case, then a gentle nudge towards the like, oh, but hey, we actually agree that we weren't going to bring up stuff from the past. And then that might help just kind of like shift the narrative a little bit. So then we are agreeing that we're staying in the present together. And then also one of the things that I find helpful that I ask myself, like I do this with myself if I'm kind of like ruminating on the same things, but we can do this with other people, is say like, oh, is there actually something new or like more information that I don't have here? And that's why this is top of mind. Like, is there something else I need to know for why this is coming up now? Because there might be something in their mind that is very much connected to the present when for you it feels like the past, right? So just being able to check in and say like, oh, is there something here that's actually connecting this thread to the present moment that I don't understand? That also might help clear out some of that stuff that's kind of just like lingering from past conversations. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad that was helpful. All right, well,
CJ,
yeah,
thank
I'm
you
gonna turn it
so
over.
much.
Yeah.
The information was spectacular, and you're a fantastic presenter, speaker. It was very, very clear, very helpful. Thank you so much for coming and providing this information for us. We did put in the chat a little bit ago, if you want to look that up. And CJ, thank you for putting the QR code up there too. But evaluations drive TASA, right? We're all grant driven and we need those to be reflected, and for our speaker as well. If you please take the time, it's very short. Just take a few moments and fill those out if you would please. And thank you so much. We're winding down. I think we have our closing session coming up, and we're done for this year. But all the attendees, the members, you guys drive this, right? I mean, we could not we could not have these successful conferences without you. So thank you for your participation and showing up and being part of this movement. We sincerely appreciate y'all coming and participating. Unless you have anything else, CJ, we can go ahead and end session, or any other last minute questions. Feel free.
Yeah, I didn't have anything else specifically, but yes, if there's any questions, happy to answer them. But otherwise, if we want to go about the rest of our day and have 10 minutes back, I'm good with that as well.
I don't want to make y'all feel jealous, but if you were here in person, I tell you, hey, go enjoy the beach. But I realize most of you aren't near the beach. But yeah, have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week. And thank you all so much. Thank you, CJ.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciated everybody being here and the great questions. So thank you all.
Thank you.